Hello, hello, hello. Good morning. Hopefully everyone's having a great conference so far. My name's Mark. I'm a consulting engineer at Jamf, and I'm happy to welcome you to our first session of the day in this room, Putting the Pro in Jamf Protect, Strengthening Security and Compliance with Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect. Presenters today are wonderful colleagues of mine, Daniela Lisandrello and Mike Levinick. Please welcome them to the stage. And afterwards, we'll have Q&A.
Ready?
Yeah.
Welcome to Putting the Pro in Jamf Protect. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into what we call our Protect at Jamf deployment. It may come as no surprise that we leverage our own software internally at Jamf. And in this session, we'll show you how we've configured our environment to protect against malicious actors, as well as ensure the quality of Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect. I'm Daniela, and I'm on Jamf's client platform engineering team. I'm responsible for leading Apple platform projects and initiatives. Much of my focus is on optimizing our use of Jamf's products internally and validating pre-release software in coordination with our product and engineering teams.
And I'm Michael Levinick. My new title is Quality and Safety Engineer for Jamf's AI initiatives. But until very recently, I was a team lead for macOS Protect QA. And I was one of those engineers that Daniela mentioned that she worked with for validating pre-release software. I'm also the creator of a little tool you may be familiar with known as the MUT. So before we dive in, we're going to have a quick poll of the audience. I heard a quote once that everybody has a test environment, but only some of us are lucky enough that it's not also known as prod. And I'm a little curious, who here has some sort of like small test deployment or something like that that you ship new features to or something like that before you go fleet-wide? OK, cool, about half of you. And how many feel that you're really making effective use of Pro and Protect together for things like keeping your business-critical applications safe, blocking malicious software, restricting unwanted software? Who wants to learn more about those two things? Great, you're in the right place. So our objective for this presentation is to empower you to improve your organization's compliance and security by demonstrating how we at Jamf integrate Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect together. We call this our Protect at Jamf deployment, as Daniela said. And Daniela and I work really closely on this deployment, which is why we decided to do this presentation. Our entire presentation today is sort of based around that deployment, but you're going to sort of be getting two presentations in one. First, Daniela is going to take over. She oversees a lot of the management of Pro and Protect, as she said, and she's going to walk you through how we integrate Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect together for things like keeping our business-critical applications safe, blocking malicious software, and comprehensive software restrictions. After that, I'll take you through a little bit about how we leverage Pro to help with our deployment of Jamf Protect in sort of a pre-release way. I'll show you the quality gates that we have in place. I'll talk to you about the recovery plans that we have, and the sort of data analysis that we're doing in the protected Jamf deployment. We're going to have some time for questions at the end, but we recognize that there's a ton of information here. Frankly, we had to cut a bunch of content for time. So if you don't get your question answered, feel free to find us in the halls. I'll be at the AI booth most of the week. Daniela has a presentation later today, I think in 2:05. What time?
Yeah, it's at 3 p.m. called Collaborative Governance.
Yeah, so you can find us around, and we're happy to chat. And I'm going to hand it over to Daniela to talk about the Protected Jamf remediations and protections.
Thanks, Mike. Switch the slide. OK, as Mike said, first, we'll be exploring some workflows for safeguarding business-critical software, and then jump into some strategies for block software management. Think of your most business-critical applications. If your users have local admin privileges, are you implementing any workflows in your environment to prevent them from tampering with those apps? If not, you probably should. And for those who do have some kind of automated remediation in place, could it be a little more sophisticated? Let's take a look at a real-world example using the open source application Nudge. At some organizations, ensuring this tool works as intended is critical for maintaining a regular software update patching cadence. Establishing a standardized patching workflow in which all Macs are updated within a certain period post-release is a pretty big deal when it comes to meeting IT audit requirements. As a Jamf admin faced with this challenge, I found that if I only used Jamf Pro, my options were pretty limited. But that makes sense because Pro wasn't really designed to detect and remediate. The most basic approach would have been to create a smart group for computers that don't have Nudge installed, and then just scope a reinstall policy to that group. Another option would have been to flex my scripting skills and deploy a custom launch agent that validates the application and kicks off a reinstall policy if needed. There are several limitations with both of these approaches, but more importantly, there are a ton of other more effective ways that users can tamper with an app beyond just deleting it from applications. And so the two examples I just illustrated don't cover all of the creative ways that you could build something out in Jamf Pro, but in the immortal words of Avril Lavigne, why do you have to go and make things so complicated? Surely there has to be a better way. The simplest and most effective solution is to leverage the functionality of Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect to prevent end users from tampering with Nudge or any other business-critical application. What does that look like? Well, you could build custom analytics in Jamf Protect and then tie them to Jamf Pro policies. Doing this enables Protect to add computers to smart groups, then whenever those analytics are triggered, then they could execute any policies those groups are scoped to in Pro. All right, so the first step is to create a custom analytic, right? Not so fast. Before doing anything at all in Jamf Protect or Jamf Pro, we need to strategize. Determine the most common tampering actions frustrated end users would most likely take to remove or otherwise hinder the app's functionality. We'll get to that in just a moment, but first, let me preface this by saying, your objective shouldn't be to try to detect and remediate every single tampering action possible. If you go into it with that expectation, especially at a place like Jamf where end users built the products and know how they work, you'll likely be disappointed in the outcome. Instead, your priority should be tackling the most common tampering actions to discourage the majority of end users from tampering further. If someone decides to build out a complex mechanism for circumventing your workflows, that, quite frankly, is an HR problem and not an IT problem at that point. For Nudge, and for most applications installed in the applications directory, end users are most likely to delete, modify, or move the application process, or launch agent. Equipped with this knowledge, we can now write a basic analytic detecting this behavior. And by the way, modify can mean many things here as it relates to the launch agent, so this doesn't apply strictly here. But we'll address that in just a few minutes. The goal of this session isn't to teach you how to write a custom analytic, but I did write this right after I took the Jamf 370 course, so you definitely don't need years and years of experience with Jamf Protect to be able to figure this out. Protect even has pop-out documentation that you can use as an aid. It's right there in the top right. And we'll include this custom analytic in our handout, so you don't have to worry about copying it down or taking a screenshot or anything right now. To start, we set the sensor type as file system event. Then we define the events. As I mentioned, we want to know when files are deleted, modified, or moved. Event is modified equals 1 covers the modify portion, while event type equals 1 represents deletion and technically movement as well, because moving a file effectively deletes it from its original location. After defining the events, we list the paths of the files that we want to monitor events on. So the application process, application, and launch agent. And of course, we also want to set an identifier value for our Jamf Pro Smart Group under Analytic Actions. At Jamf, we've also implemented a second custom analytic, and this one identifies another common approach to modifying the launch agent that isn't covered by the first analytic, sorry. That is detecting unload or boot out attempts. We're not going to show that predicate in this session because it's a bit more complex and mileage can vary greatly depending on the target application you're using it with. But the reason I mention it is so that you're aware that launch agent tampering at a more granular level can be addressed. And what I will say is, if you are interested in that launch agent approach, pay special attention to a couple things. First, does the application unload and unload its own launch agent to perform any critical functions? Does the reinstall policy mess with the launch agent in some way when you're setting that up through Jamf Pro? If so, make sure you account for those things in your predicate so that you can avoid a remediation policy loop, which is a pretty disastrous thing, to put it lightly. So now that we have our custom analytic, how is Jamf Pro involved? By leveraging the Jamf Protect Smart Groups computer extension attribute template in Jamf Pro, we can tie it to the Jamf Protect analytic and the remediation workflow as a whole. Here, you'll see that the corresponding value for Jamf Protect Smart Groups matches the Jamf Protect analytic identifier that we just set. Any computer that triggers that analytic is added to this smart group. As a side note, that nudge temporary exclusions static group we have in there is so that Jamf IT support can troubleshoot with an end user without having to worry that they're going to trigger this remediation workflow. Now, to take action against that smart group, we'll need a policy. The remediate nudge policy is scoped to our smart computer group and has a custom protect trigger attached to it. This policy contains a script that essentially just removes that computer from the group and triggers a second policy to reinstall nudge. Now, you could keep it simple and complete the reinstall within the same policy, but in our environment, we wanted to make sure the logs were consolidated for simplicity, so that's why we have it built out in different parts. We've also enabled self-guided reinstalls through self-service. All right. Now that everything is configured and ready to go, here's what the end user experience looks like. This end user simply doesn't have time to update their computer to the latest version of macOS. But the nudge deadline is quickly approaching, and the prompt is appearing more frequently. So in an attempt to prevent the nudge window from popping up, they rename the application process from nudge to grudge, perhaps echoing their state of mind. I'm not sure. Seconds after the end user tampers with nudge, the application and its components are reinstalled. Any subsequent attempts that, if they try to do this again, will produce the same result. And yes, you heard that right, seconds. With the protect binary, remediation is near immediate, whereas with pro policies, it's limited to once every check-in, which could be anywhere from 5 minutes all the way up to an hour. That second custom analytic I mentioned before, the one detecting launch agent unload attempts, works similarly. So back to our end user, after their attempt to rename the application process fails, the end user runs a terminal command to unload the nudge launch agent, which effectively will disable the scheduled update prompts. But the same remediation workflow kicks off, and nudge is reinstalled. Behind the scenes, the user's tampering action triggered our custom analytic in Jamf Protect, and their computer was added to the smart group we created earlier in Jamf Pro. As you'll recall, that smart group is scoped to the nudge remediation policy, and after it runs, the computer is then removed from that smart group. Again, as we mentioned earlier, this model can apply to virtually any business-critical app and not just nudge. So if you don't have nudge, you can still use this as a model for some of your other apps. Now that we've demonstrated how Jamf Protect can enhance Jamf Pro remediation workflows, let's discuss a few additional details you should take into consideration before moving forward. Do you want to make your presence known? Remediation can be performed silently, as you saw in the demo video, or a message can be displayed to the user. Jamf Helper, Swift Dialog, Apple Script, or really any other custom dialog utility can be used for this messaging. It's up to you. When determining whether to incorporate this user messaging, you should consider, 1, the culture of transparency. IT and security teams could be concerned that explicit messaging might encourage users to start tampering with the protect agent or the device's management state. Silent remediation, while it may not completely deter further tampering actions, might be preferable over pointing users directly towards what's preventing them from doing these actions. At Jamf, we use silent remediation not because we think that we can outsmart our users, that's not what we're trying to do, but it's really because our users understand and honestly sometimes resent the fact that Nudge is doing this. But to them, an inability to move it makes sense because even though they don't agree with its persistence, they know it's related to our compliance objectives and policies. Which brings us to number 2, impact on IT support. With silent remediation, there could be some end-user confusion. So employees could open support tickets to find out why this app that they're trying to delete keeps coming back. But this is especially likely if the app could seem trivial on the surface. So an example would be maybe a user prefers Zoom, so they keep deleting WebEx, but their organization requires WebEx to be on all managed devices. At Jamf, we maintain a ton of documentation about our deployments and compliance requirements. What I would recommend, if your organization is going to insist on silent remediation, is to publish internal information about your information security policies and the business critical applications in your environment. That way, IT support can easily direct end users to it. It kind of seems like a no-brainer and a very simple solution, but it really does go a long way and saves everybody some time. And finally, whether your approach is fully transparent or totally secret, whether your anti-tampering measures are basic or incorporate a bunch of over-engineered analytics, recall what we said earlier about HR problems versus IT problems. And keep that in mind when you're developing your strategy so that you can choose a path that really best fits your organization as a whole instead of just overcomplicating your workflows. And the point of this, really, which applications to protect, how complex these protections should be, and whether to include end-user messaging, all of that is up to you and should be based on the specific needs of your organization. And hopefully, we've given you some tools to be able to start developing your own strategy. All right, so now that we've discussed how to safeguard your most critical applications, let's talk about how to restrict certain apps from use in your environment. Assuming you already have a list of apps to block, and if you don't, you should probably work with InfoSec to iron that out, what are your options? With Jamf Pro, for applications that can't be blocked with a macOS configuration profile, admins turn to restricted software records. Whereas with Protect, apps can be restricted through custom prevent lists. In the interest of time, we won't be able to go through all of the differences and talking points for these two features, but hopefully we'll provide you with enough insight to make some informed decisions about how to do this in your environment. Before breaking these features down, I'll share our own strategy. Internally at Jamf, we apply most of our restrictions through custom prevent lists. But for unsigned apps and apps that should only be blocked for certain device groups, we use restricted software records. This two-pronged strategy with Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect enables us to enforce comprehensive, practical application restrictions on our managed devices. Now here's how we developed that approach. Restricted software records are one of the easier items for new Jamf admins to configure, and they're fairly straightforward to interpret. Applications are restricted by process name, which makes them preferable for unsigned apps. A custom message can be displayed to end users, informing them that the application they're trying to use is blocked. The biggest advantage with this, in my opinion, is custom scoping. Maybe there's an application that is critical to a specific team's responsibility, but for the rest of the organization, it could be considered a distraction. With a restricted software record, you can block that app for everyone except for that team. There are, unfortunately, several downsides to this feature, which really can undermine its efficacy. The biggest pain point, unquestionably, is how easy it is for end users to get around restrictions applied through this method. This is very much an if you know kind of situation, and we're not going to list all the tricks here. But if you're paying attention to the macOS remediation workflow section, you might be able to guess a couple of those tricks. Another aspect of restricted software records that isn't ideal are the limitations surrounding the kind of information that you can use to target apps. You're pretty much limited to the process name, and yet there are more static and reliable attributes that are more enforceable, which leads us to custom prevent lists, which block and quarantine applications at the signing level or using the file hash. As a result, these restrictions are more difficult to circumvent unless the user modifies the app itself or tampers with the Jamf Protect agent. And if tamper prevention is enabled for Jamf Protect, tampering with that agent is going to be a little more difficult. They're also scalable. Separate lists can be created for individual apps, or they can all be placed into a single list. Alternatively, you can also group them into lists that are organized by category, and this is the strategy that we're using at Jamf. So for example, we have a torrent clients prevent list that has signing IDs for any application that could be under that category. Now, all of that is awesome, but with most technology, there's definitely some room for improvement. Unsigned applications cannot be easily targeted with custom prevent lists unless the file hash is used, and even then, that will only restrict a specific version of that app. Additionally, custom prevent lists don't support custom end-user messaging. And finally, the biggest advantage of restricted software records is actually the biggest limitation of custom prevent lists. And that is that restrictions can't be scoped to individual devices or Jamf Protect plans. They're applied globally, so they should really only be used for universally blocked apps. In comparing these two features, we aren't trying to sell you on one or the other. And while custom prevent lists may be more effective than restricted software records on their own, blending both is even more effective. And you can do the same in your environment. Now, before you get too excited and start creating a bunch of restrictions, a word of caution. Sometimes less is more. What we don't recommend is using both for the same applications unless you want end users to be spammed with a bunch of pop-ups like they just went to a shady website or triggered a fatal system error. Okay, in reality, it'll look something like this. Still not the ideal end user experience. So again, it's best to choose whichever option is a better fit for the individual apps you're intending to block. I know all of that was a lot of information, but the point that I'm trying to make is Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect are better together. And now that we've discussed integrated Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect application management workflows in depth, I'll hand it over to Mike so he can show you how we leverage Pro and Protect for data collection and feature testing.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniela. So something that we've talked about occasionally here at JNUC in the past is that we're huge advocates for what's often referred to as eating our own dog food. Now, our marketing folks would rather we call it drinking our own champagne. They don't like us calling our software dog food. But the end result is the same. We leverage our own software at Jamf, and we're often running versions that haven't yet been released to the public. Now, the needs of your organization are going to differ drastically from ours here at Jamf, but we also recognize that A/B testing of new features and versions in a small deployment is something that's desirable to a lot of admins, and we thought it might be cool to show you how we've set up our environment to do that in a safe manner. So in order to make effective use of that dog champagne, we have to have a few things in place. Primarily, we need to make sure that we're keeping our fleet and our data at Jamf safe through quality gates and risk mitigation processes. Second of all, we have to have a recovery plan in place just in case something does go wrong. And finally, we need to make sure that we're gathering useful data and analyzing it in a useful way to make all of this work worth the time and effort that we're putting into it. Shipping something to Protect at Jamf before it goes public is useless if we don't do anything with what happens in the Protect at Jamf deployment. So some of these quality gates don't have as much to do with putting the Pro in Protect, but we thought you might find it interesting to know how we're testing this stuff before we go live with it internally at Jamf, since it's pre-release software. So before any of our software ever gets into your hands, we have an extensive set of quality gates that we go through. We're firm believers that risk mitigation begins in refinement. So our QA engineers are highly involved in the development process early on in things like tech design and refinement. We're having conversations with the engineers and the product team, talking about the changes that are coming down, how they're going to impact the product, and making sure that we're taking all things into consideration so that not only is it going to be bug-free, but it's going to be pleasant for y'all to use as well. After that, our engineers are obviously going through code reviews, checking each other's code, testing each other's code, and things like that. They also have their own unit tests that they are writing and maintaining. And there's integration tests sort of across the board. Those integration tests are going to look a little bit different depending on the component. Jamf Protect front-end tests are going to look different than extension tests and things like that. But then it all comes together. The final step from an automation standpoint is a series of end-to-end system tests that are run. These are run against a multitude of different operating systems. They're run against our latest release branch as well as our latest development branch. They're run every single night, and they're also run against like PR merges and things like that as well. After we're through all of that, we hand it over to the QA engineers, and we let them do the critical thinking that they do best. Instead of automation, they're putting their thinking like a customer hat on, and they're just doing some exploratory testing on these products and features, and again, making sure that it feels good to use and that they're not finding any additional bugs. And that's happening in high-risk areas. Those high-risk areas, again, are sort of informed by conversations with the engineers as well as the product team, like, hey, what code changed? What should we be paying attention to with that code change? Is there anything we're not thinking of here? And then after all of that is done, we go to our actual alpha deployment. And this is split into what we call closed and open alpha. And the open alpha is really just the entire deployment at Jamf. We call it open alpha. But we also do have a smaller closed alpha that we go to first. It's about 50 people right now. In that closed open, or in the closed alpha rather, we're doing things like monitoring for crashes, performance issues, elevated queues, things like that. We put a lot of thought into what we wanted this closed alpha deployment to look like. Now, this may be changing in the future, but as of right now, it's really just two different plans. And that allows us to A/B test anything that we configured at the plan level. We can A/B test new features, custom analytics. We can turn off auto update and push a specific version to the closed alpha. So this two-plan approach, again, it might be changing in the future, but right now that lets us A/B test anything that can be configured at the plan level. The way that we do that is through this opt-in approach. We put a lot of thought into like who we wanted in this closed alpha. Did we want it to be the engineering folks? Did we want it to be just the Protect team? Did we want it to be a bunch of folks in QA? I talked to Daniela, and she put this awesome policy in place in self-service. So if we identify somebody that we think would make a good candidate for our closed alpha, we can just reach out to them on Slack and say, hey, head out to self-service and click that opt-in button. If you have any problems, it's going to flip to a different policy, and you can click opt-out, and you can get back out and onto the stable version. But yeah, we can just tell people to head out to self-service and opt in, or they can stumble across it on their own. And typically the folks that are stumbling across it and want in are the folks that we want in anyway. Going with this opt-in approach had a benefit that we weren't really considering. It gives us a really great representative cross-section of the company. There's folks in sales, folks in marketing, folks in product, leadership, engineering, QA, really across the board. And those people are all using their computers in very different ways, and we're gathering really interesting information based on how the product interacts with their various workflows, which is pretty cool. So yeah, like 50 people in there, but it's really excellent information in a great representative cross-section. Once something actually does go to the open alpha or closed alpha, we want to have a recovery plan in place just in case something goes wrong. Now, the good news is we're a system extension. We're not in the kernel. So ending up in a situation where we kernel panic the entire fleet and boot loop everybody, requiring hands-on to recover, just isn't something that we're really likely ever to come across. But we do recognize that something might go wrong. Typically, when that happens, it is a performance-related issue. Maybe a developer is using an add-on in VS Code or a Docker workflow that just isn't jiving with the product, and we didn't run across that in our testing. Now, the good news is the majority of the time, we can simply demote the package that we just promoted, because Jamf Protect's auto update feature is actually also an auto downgrade feature. It's going to make sure that your entire fleet is on the version that you want it on, whether they were running a version higher or lower. So if you run the wrong installer, whether it was higher or lower, it doesn't matter. They're going to be put on the correct version. But in a situation where maybe auto update was turned off for A/B testing, or we broke auto update somehow, which I don't think has ever happened, but it might, we can kindly ask Daniela to put a pro policy in place with a protect package and just push it out to the fleet and get everybody right back onto that stable version that we want them on, easy peasy. Finally, a sort of a worst case scenario, something that we've definitely never needed to use, but something we did take into consideration when building all of this out. We do have a cloud backup solution that we manage through Jamf Pro as well, and we can restore everybody that way. Again, we've never had to use it. I don't expect that we ever will. But when we're building out something like this, we want to, make sure our I's are crossed and our T's are dotted. So once something is actually in that open or closed alpha, we want to do some data analysis on it. At the heart of all of this data analysis are Jamf Pro extension attributes. We're gathering a ton of information from Jamf Pro about Jamf Protect. Many of these extension attributes are just the built-in templates in Jamf Pro. But there are some out there on GitHub as well. We'll be taking a look at some of those a little more closely in just a second. We get a report sent to us every day that has just a wealth of information in it from Jamf Pro. Daniela set up those reports to send out daily as well. And anybody who wants to get them can get a huge CSV file in their inbox with just a ton of data every single morning. In addition to that, there's telemetry data that Jamf Protect gathers, along with some local logs and things like that, and that all gets sent out to the SIM. We can get access to that if we need to and figure out what's going on in these devices. We have automatic crash detection tooling that we're monitoring. We're always monitoring it, but we pay extra attention to it around release time, whether that's a closed alpha release, open alpha release, or even a prod release. We're looking for trends in the number of crashes across the product. And then on the off chance that we do see any anomalies in any of this, we have a diagnostic data collection workflow that, again, we'll be taking a look at here in just a second, that sends a ton of information up to S3, where we can get access to it and do a little bit more forensic analysis on some of this. So I mentioned the extension attributes. These are sort of the heart of all of the data analysis. Most of what we're looking at day to day are these extension attributes. And again, the majority of these are just the templates included right in Jamf Pro. But looking at them, they're relatively simple for the most part. This one, for example, is gathering the version of the binary that the machine is running. And it's simply calling the protect control binary, running the info command with the plist flag, passing that through plist buddy to parse out the pertinent information, and then it gives the result to the extension attribute, which gets sent off to Jamf Pro. But I mentioned that there are a bunch out on GitHub as well. We put a link to this in our handout as well. There's a link to this page with all of the extension attributes, and there's also a link to a couple of them that we thought you might find especially useful out there. So we do have this open source GitHub with a bunch of other information, and we're leveraging quite a few of these as well. The inventory record, once they're all gathered in, looks a little bit like this. You can see there's just a ton of data there in Jamf Pro about the health of Jamf Protect, which is awesome. And then the reports that I mentioned get sent to us every single morning. We used to have these broken out by connection status, whether a device was connected, disconnected, trying to connect. We also had them broken out by whether the device was in open alpha or closed alpha. But as we get a little bit better at this data analysis aspect of the job, we found that that really wasn't what we wanted. So now we have everything just sort of combined into one big report, because it turns out that there's tools out there to parse that information in one big report and filter out the things that you're trying to look for. So looking at the report, I know that's going to be a little bit small up there, but we've got an arrow that's going to point to a few different things. We're collecting the Jamf Protect binary version, and we're looking for anomalies like the binary not being installed, or perhaps a device that's running an old binary version. Maybe we pushed a new version. We expect everybody to update. Not everybody has updated. We're wondering what's going on with that. We're looking at the connection state of the device. In theory, these devices all sent these reports up to Jamf Pro. So finding a device that's in like a disconnected state at first blush can maybe seem like something that we want to look into. Jamf Protect also has some send queues. If you generate an event with Jamf Protect, it's going to try to send it off to either the SIM or the backend or wherever it's trying to send it to. And if it's not able to, for whatever reason, it's going to cache that event and queue it for send at a later date. And seeing some elevations in those queue sizes might be something that we want to look into. This is also probably one of the ones that you're going to be most interested in if you're A/B testing like a custom analytic. If a custom analytic is misconfigured, it can be extremely noisy, and you can actually generate events even faster than we can send them off to our backend. And so if you're A/B testing a custom analytic, pay attention to these queue sizes and pay attention to the number of events that were generated, which is also available in that info command, because that can give you some really good information about if you need to fine-tune your custom analytic that you're building out. There's also a couple things that live on the machine. There's the extension attribute, or not the extension attribute, but the system extension rather, which is actually performing the blocking and the actions like that. There's also a launch agent, which is handling things like gathering certain insight information and doing the pop-ups and stuff like that. And we're monitoring the health of that as well. And at first, when we first started digging through these reports, we were like, whoa, there's devices disconnected. There's devices with elevated queues. Our environment is terrible. What's going on? But as we really started digging into all of these anomalies, we discovered that they were all explainable by really benign situations. Maybe somebody was on vacation. Maybe it was 3 p.m. AMER time and they were in Europe. They were obviously at the pub. Or something else was going on. Maybe it was a test device that had been accidentally enrolled and then was unenrolled or something like that. But anytime we started chasing these anomalies specifically, our heads started spinning. So we've moved to a world where we're more tracking trends now. I don't care if 10% of my fleet was disconnected. I care if 10% is more or less than it was on the last version of Protect. And so even just numbers gives you the ability to look at some of this. You can go organize and filter. You can drill into specific columns, and you can see numbers across the fleet for any of these things. And you can open yesterday's report and today's report and sort of compare and contrast that way. But we're in sort of the early stages of starting to move to leveraging more powerful tools like Power BI, where we can build out a dashboard looking at some of these things, feed in the daily report, and have a much more visual representation of some of these trends across the fleet. Now, I did also mention that there is this analytic, or the diagnostic gathering workflow as well. That's also available on our GitHub, and we put a link to that in our handout as well. This was built by Thijs Scheffler, a fellow Jamf, an absolute genius, super great guy. Actually, you saw him doing the demo for the keynote. But yeah, he built this workflow out, and basically what it's going to do is it's a Jamf Pro policy, and when it runs, it gathers up some diagnostic data for Jamf Protect, and then it's going to upload it to wherever you want. I think there's one that'll do a few different places. We use the S3 one, and so that data just lands in S3 and looks a bit like this. So if there is a situation where, I know we said we don't like to chase anomalies, but if we see something that's we definitely want to look into it, or if we're trending in the wrong direction, we can grab some of those devices, and we can get some really verbose information. There's a process sample in here. There's a bunch of logs. There is energy usage, so we can see are CPU levels elevated or not for these devices. We can see what kinds of events they were generating and what that all looks like through the info output. Just a wealth of information that's in there. We have this scope to everybody in closed alpha running once a day. So we're just constantly ingesting all of this data. But we can also do things like scoping it out to specific devices if they have an extremely elevated queue. or if we see some other anomaly in the report that we feel like looking into. So again, as Daniela said, I know that's a ton of information. Really, all of this is just how we do this here at Jamf, but I'm hoping that at least some of it might be pertinent to you in your environments, and even if it's not, hopefully you find it interesting seeing how we do some of this testing and stuff like that, and we can get you thinking about it.
All right, to wrap up, let's quickly review what we've covered in today's session. We've demonstrated how Jamf Protect can enhance macOS security and remediation workflows implemented with Jamf Pro. We've shared best practice strategies for testing and adopting features in Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect. And we've shown you how to leverage Jamf Pro to collect useful Jamf Pro Protect data. If there are only a handful of things that you take away from our presentation, we hope they're the following. First, there is a ton of opportunity for customization. What works for our organization may not work for yours. So apply the information from today's session to implement workflows that really address your organization's needs. Further, Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect each have their own strengths. So you should leverage these accordingly to fill any identified compliance gaps. Next, we all know data collection is important, but collecting the right data is even more important. And finally, the macOS security landscape is constantly changing. Your Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect configurations should be changing alongside it.
We'll open it up for questions. I think Mark is going to go around with the microphone and stick it in your face if you have something for us.
Great job, both of you. We've got maybe about 3 minutes for questions, and then I'm sure can find you after the session as well. Raise your hand, and I will run over to you for any questions. Was that good?
I don't know about that.
Well, with that said, thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Mike. And have a wonderful rest of the day.